Obviously, the dramatic and tragic events of last week in Connecticut call upon all of us to be part of the solution to the problem of gun violence in America. Clearly, any conversation has to start with the stipulation that we're the only country that has firearms mentioned in its founding document. We have to recognize that it's a strongly held belief and a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. But what we must not do is retreat to the same old, tired debates that occur every time there's a national tragedy. We've got to stop yelling at each other, and we have to start talking to each other. And we must balance talk of individual rights with talk of mutual responsibility. Now, we have before us evidence of the proliferation of military-style assault weapons in the hands of arrested criminals, placing the lives of officers and of innocents at risk as they ply their deadly trade. Now, mass murder may never be a curable event. Gun violence in America may not be curable events in the aggregate, but we can make it harder to commit mass murder. We can make it harder for criminals to procure firearms to continue their deadly ways. Now, let me give you a few data points. Since 2008, when I was sworn in, the Milwaukee Police Department has seized from the streets of Milwaukee 10,680 firearms. 2,200 of those were rifles, and 264 of those weapons were military-style assault weapons. Over that same period of time, since I've been here, 28 children under the age of 13 have been shot on the streets of Milwaukee. During that same period of time, we have had numerous firearms shootings and woundings in the last 2 years. In 2011, we had 87 homicides, 60 of which were gun homicides. In 2012, we've had 86 homicides, 69 of them, 80%, have been committed with firearms. In the last 2 years, we have had over 1,000 non-fatal shootings on the streets of our city. We have two types of firearms problems confronting us in America, and they require attempts at solutions at different levels of government. The problem of mass murder is a problem that can only be addressed at the federal level because of the implements of destruction require common regulations across state lines. Now, I'm a member of the Major City Chiefs Association. Those are the police chiefs of the 50 biggest cities in the United States of America. And we have basically a position on firearms laws not dissimilar from that of the Mayors Against Illegal Guns. Major city chiefs want legislation that bans high-capacity magazines, those that hold greater than 10 rounds apiece. We want to see legislation that requires that unlicensed private sales, such as those that take place at gun shows, still require a criminal record check, just as one does through a licensed federal firearms dealer. We want to see the assault weapons ban reinstated, and we want to encourage stiffer penalties for possession of illegal firearms. We want to ban the internet sale of ammunition and require in-person transactions and records of sales and licenses of ammunition vendors. We believe that given the fact that during the term that the Brady Bill existed, there was a decrease in crimes committed with assault weapons of 66% during the era that that law was in force. We would hope to see similar results if we reintroduced that ban. Now, we recognize that there are millions of weapons already in the hands of Americans. We recognize that we continue to be challenged by firearms that are stolen, not just firearms that are legally purchased. But that does not excuse inaction and pleas of helplessness. Our citizens overwhelmingly want to see intelligent gun control, whether they are firearms owners, NRA members, or not. But people have spoken again and again. Professional law enforcement has spoken again and again. And it's time for craven legislators to stop hiding behind their metal detectors and their police force in Congress and join the rest of Americans who are vulnerable to gun violence by assisting them in making those first important steps to address it. This requires bipartisanship. It requires discussion. A year ago, I was quoted in a newspaper as saying that I couldn't believe that there was any event horrifying enough that would finally cause Congress to act. Well, maybe 20 dead babies is it. Just maybe. It remains to be seen. Sadly, we've been down this road many times before and been met only with inaction. When it comes to the state level, the state is better positioned than the federal government is to reduce the kind of firearms violence that plagues Milwaukee. We have put forward an eminently reasonable and narrowly defined package to reform the gun laws of Wisconsin. And that's the key. Whether it's federal law or state law, those laws must be narrowly focused on the problem we're trying to fix. We can't allow people to try to paint narrow solutions as broad-based bans on people's rights. These have to be narrowly focused. We have to be narrowly focused on things like assault weapons and ammunition capacity, because we've seen what lack of regulation can do. When it comes to dealing with firearms here in Wisconsin, the murderous violence on the streets of Milwaukee is overwhelmingly committed by criminals. 85% of our shooting victims have criminal records. But the problem is those weapons are high-quality weapons legally purchased by straw purchasers. That's got to change. It has got to be a felony to buy a gun for a criminal. Secondly, we are the only state that I know of that it's a misdemeanor to illegally carry a concealed weapon. If you are in gang life, if you are in criminal life, it is more dangerous for you to get caught without your gun than to get caught with it. That's got to change. We have got to make it a felony with a sentence attached that's mandatory for somebody illegally possessing a firearm. Surely our colleagues in the legislature must see the logic of this. Thirdly, right now our permitting process allows habitual criminals to get gun permits. We've already encountered them on the street. These are people with criminal assault records, criminal records being arrested sometimes for serious crimes, but given the nature of the pressures of urban jurisdictions, not convicted for felonies. They can legally get a gun and carry it in this state. That's an absurdity. Please help us reduce the violence here. We'd like to see convicted felons kept 1,000 feet from a gun store. Why? Well, because usually the straw purchaser gets out of the car having been just told exactly what kind of gun to buy by their boyfriend. Let's keep him far away from the store. Let's at least make it a little more inconvenient to try to do that. So there's two levels of challenge of gun violence in this country. Both are worthy of discussion. One conversation has to start at the state level, and that's how can the state help us reduce the fact that we have got so many victims of firearms violence in this city. 80% of our homicide victims are shot to death. Can you imagine if we could reduce homicides by 80%? We need help to do that. We cannot do it alone. And when it comes to the federal level, only federal laws make sense to regulate the types of weapons used to commit mass murder. This is a distinctly American problem, the problem of mass murder. Surely we can fashion a distinctly American solution.
The NRA for years has said they are strong supporters of law enforcement. I don't think anyone would dispute that. Yet they often oppose the very kinds of laws that you proposed in your address. Why is that?
The NRA has very disingenuously for years done a lot of training for police officers on firearms, and they run some very good firearms courses. They have never taken a public policy position that truly supported law enforcement. Law enforcement for a generation has been advocating for common sense limitations on unfettered access to firearms. We've strongly supported criminal background checks. We've strongly supported, the assault weapons ban. We've strongly, supported bans on high-capacity magazines because we're experienced with dealing with the deadly violence of our communities. We'd like our opinions thought of as expert opinions. The NRA does not support law enforcement, or it would be responding to the murders of law enforcement officers rather than responding to the apparent need to arm their assailants more easily. And that is the logical output of all of their legislation. They are a powerful, small, well-funded lobby group. That's all they are. Even gun orders don't support their positions, and it's time for our legislators to disenthrall themselves of the power of this group. It's time to write a new book of profiles in courage, and this has got to be the first chapter.
What would you expect them to say tomorrow at their national news conference?
The NRA. They are probably going to extend their condolences and then start talking about rights again. Well, you know what? That's a very difficult discussion to have. But there was a time when slavery existed in the Constitution too. But Abraham Lincoln got the notion that the Declaration of Independence guaranteed that everybody was created equal. Well, it seems to me the Declaration of Independence also says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are life. And I would like to think that the Declaration of Independence guarantee that to guarantee life is one of the reasons governments are instituted among men. Maybe that has a bearing on how we interpret and reasonably regulate the Second Amendment. Every amendment in the Constitution is subjected to reasonable regulation. Every amendment. That's why there are libel laws that govern the First Amendment. Every amendment has reasonable regulations. The Second Amendment can be no exception, and when the Supreme Court extended the Second Amendment to individuals, it also said specifically reasonable regulations are entirely within the intent of the Constitution. That conversation's got to start. We got to get beyond the yelling at each other, all right, and start talking about how do we limit the likelihood that the kind of horrific events we saw last Friday occur again.
Time for one more question.
How do you combat the situation where there are millions of these guns, millions of high-capacity mags out there already?
It's true. There's 300 million guns out there already. Number one, nobody's looking to confiscate all of your firearms, all right, because that's the first place that when the debate starts to go down the rabbit hole, that's what happens. They're going to come take our guns away. That's not what this discussion is about. We're trying to limit the likelihood of certain kinds of conduct. Second thing is, gun buyback programs generally don't work because they're small amounts of money and everybody brings in grandpa's flintlock. If you're going to do gun buyback and you want to get assault rifles off the street, then maybe we ought to take some of our drug confiscation money. I'll give you $1,000 for an assault rifle. All right, put the profit motive in it. Buy the darn things back for what they're worth if we need to get there someday. But the bottom line is, as the mayor just said, a lot of people out there with assault weapons are never going to hurt anybody. But the fact of the matter is those high-capacity magazines really create that situation the mayor alluded to. There's 25 teachers in that school. They could not rush him because he didn't have to reload for 50 or 60 shots. Everybody's dead. All right? In the olden days, somebody went in there with a 6-shooter. They fired their 6 shots. You had a chance if you were unarmed. This takes away that chance. The streets of our cities should not be subject to being free fire zones. And so going after how many bullets you can walk around with your legal weapon, I think is a reasonable limitation that reasonable people on both sides of the issue of who can hold what kind of guns should be able to come to some kind of consensus on.
Hey, Chief, the representative mentioned a guy who was bipolar and used a gun, I think, out in Brookfield. What percentage of people that your officers come into contact with would you estimate have some sort of mental illness? Not just people with guns, just in general.
Well, that's a very important discussion that the mayor and I have recently had. One of the disconcerting things I learned when I was a Secretary of Public Safety was one of the departments that reported to me was Department of Correction. And it was there in Massachusetts that I learned that the Department of Correction was the largest mental health facility in the Commonwealth. And as we looked into it more, we began to realize that, back in the heyday of deinstitutionalization, the mantra was community-based treatment. It never happened. Every state in the country wildly cut back expenditures on mental illness treatment in order to save money. I think currently Wisconsin ranks 25th in the country on what it spends on mental illness, and that includes the Department of Correction budget. We're left with a situation where my cops are out there in the middle of the night dealing with people who have mental illness or a dual diagnosis. They have mental illness and substance abuse problems, and no one will accept them. Now, I know a lot of people decry how many people are in jail at any given time, but American society has delegated mental illness to the criminal justice system. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, when there is somebody on the streets of Wisconsin Avenue, addled, and possibly a danger to themselves at least, and we can't get them committed anywhere, we have no tool but to arrest them. So yes, I mean, while we're talking about this, it's not an either or. Clearly, rational discussion has to go about the reasonable regulations of the implements of destruction. But obviously, it's past time for American society to reconsider how it is, just as a moral issue, we treat the mentally ill. Because right now, mental illness is a criminal justice problem, not a public health problem, and that's just plain wrong.